Paris Agreement fully understood that the emission reductions that are necessary to go to net zero emissions by 2050 are actually going to be achieved over time.
Right.
Now, by 2030, we now know that we have to be at 1/2 global emissions, all of us, in order to stand the chance of being at net zero and protect economies. So where are we today? We're going into Glasgow. We already know that the United States will not, under the Trump administration, will not come with their next effort, although the US economy is actually probably going to comply with what they said they were going to do in Paris 5 years ago, just because so many corporations, states, cities, and financial actors understand that it is good for their economy. So we're not going to have universal participation in the step up. We actually are very much hoping that the bushfires in Australia are going to be such a dramatic wake-up call to everyone here that Australia will actually come with a responsible position to Glasgow. He's talking about a target actually that belongs in a very different regime, in the Kyoto Protocol regime. And just because we were talking about fantastic women's sports, I think everyone will understand that no team in the world expects to take the score from one game into the next game. You start the game at zero, or you can certainly not take the score of one tournament into the next tournament. And that's what we're seeing here. Those credits belong in the Kyoto Protocol regime. That is finished, and we now have started the Paris Agreement regime. You cannot carry over from one to the other. We have to recognize that there was a very valuable role of the fossil fuel industry, in particular coal, in the past century. So we cannot demonize that for what it contributed in the 20th century. However, now that we know what the pernicious effects of coal burning are to our personal health, to our human being health, as well as to the planetary health, now we understand that we absolutely have to go beyond coal. And we could not have aspired to that if we didn't have alternative technologies that can actually move in. So we now know that we have renewables and that Australia is actually quite abundantly blessed with both solar and with wind. And we know that Australia is actually one of the world leaders in storage, whether it be battery or hydro. So there are many possibilities for Australia actually to be able to substitute coal in its domestic energy if we have an upgrade in the grid and if we have enough investment into pump storage. Australia can most definitely get out of coal for its domestic use. The fact is that solar is already so much cheaper than coal. It is much more healthy for everyone, and if it is backed up, if it's firmed up with storage, which Australia is already doing with its big battery, as well as with hydro down in Tasmania, then it is entirely possible to avoid polluting the air, killing people's lungs, and being so irresponsible about the global atmosphere that ultimately is the worst enemy of Australian safety for its citizens. The Australian bushfires, honestly, when the history of climate change is written, we will write the history of climate change before the bushfires and after, because there has never been a more evident, deeply traumatic experience of the huge impacts of climate change other than the Australian bushfires. The price of wind and solar has come down 80 and 90% over the past 10 years. They are now competitive. Wind and solar, check mark. They are now market-based, very, very powerful energy sources, particularly in Australia. It is not every country in the world that is so generously blessed with those two resources. So now it is about making sure that the right investments are done in order to take Australia into the 21st century, both with its domestic energy, as well as, frankly, with its export products. Because no one can tell us that the 21st century is going to continue to grow based on fossil fuels. That is simply impossible. It is not true. And Australia should not condemn itself to continue using technologies that are obsolete and that belong in the past century. That is not fair to the Australian economy. You do not want to be stranded here with assets that lose their value over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years max. And I've always been of the opinion that those of us who work on climate have actually focused way too much on the doom and gloom. In Australia, the bushfires have actually brought the attention to that. And at the same time, what I think we have been lacking is actually to be able to paint the picture, to really build out in people's imagination what is an economy like Australia going to be like 10, 15 years from now when it has moved over to renewables? What does it mean for the quality of cities? What does it mean for the quality of agriculture? What does it mean for the Great Barrier Reef? What does it mean for camping in the bush safely without having to worry about breaking out fires? It is a much, much safer, healthier, longer term, stable economy that can definitely build and must be built. But we haven't painted that picture very well. And hence, if you do not have a visual destination of the positive world that you want to construct, it's very difficult for people to gravitate there. Obviously, the doom and gloom makes us concerned, helpless, hopeless, despair, grief, all that family of sentiments that are important because we have to understand what is out there. But we have not been able to point to the fact that actually now, in this decade, we are in the most consequential decade of the history of humankind. Because over the next 10 years, we will decide whether we are at one half the global emissions in order to be able to move on to much, much better, healthier, safer, more stable world. That is going to be determined over the next 10 years. And Australia has to be part of that transformation. The onus is now on the federal government. Can it be done completely without the federal government? Much more difficult and with much more delay. Interesting that in the United States, 65% of the economy continues to decarbonize despite the position of the federal government because they know that it's in their interest. This is not about saving the planet. This is about, if you're a corporation, this is about business continuity. If you're the mayor of a city, this is about livability in your city. And we have to understand that this is a movement toward something that is better. Yes, of course, alignment from the federal to state and territory to city government to private corporations, all of that perfect alignment gives us the quickest move forward. But frankly, it is time to move beyond delay, delude, and deny, and understand that what we have in front of us is actually a very different strategy that is prevent, produce, profit, and prosper. Coronavirus actually has very interesting lessons for us. For one thing, yes, as we just discussed, it is a shock. We don't know what the long-term impact. Compared to climate change, we are dealing with both short-term shocks, evidence the bushfires, and long-term impact. And second thing, coronavirus is completely unexpected, came out of nowhere, not so with climate change. The Garneau report, 2008, already told every single Australian, you are going to see bushfires, and in fact, they will be observable by 2020. That was written way back in 2008. So no one should say that we're here in unknown territory. What is actually very concerning is that the impacts that we are experiencing, particularly in Australia, are coming forward in speed much quicker than scientists had ever realized, because we're on the verge of irreversible tipping points that will cause huge ecosystems, for example, the Great Barrier Reef, to tip over and completely transform themselves for the negative. That is the piece that we absolutely have to avoid. I don't have to tell you that the Great Barrier Reef is spectacular and unique in the world. And yes, it has been severely damaged by the warming of the waters. But it is absolutely critical to safeguard what is still there. And the only way to do that is to control temperatures. The tourism industry in Australia gives direct jobs to 650,000 people. Those jobs have to be protected. I guarantee that if the Great Barrier Reef ever turns into, and let's hope it doesn't, but if it ever turns into the greatest aquatic cemetery of the world, that is not exactly going to bring tourists to this country. We have to be able to maintain the treasures of Australia, both on land as well as underwater.
Right.
Because the two of them, plus the beautiful cities, those are what attracts the kind of tourism that Australia has. I take part of the grief, the despair, the anguish, the grief. I cannot tell you how much I suffered viewing the news of the bushfires every single day. So I am also in pain because of the loss that we're seeing. And having said that, I also believe very firmly that we cannot stay in the pain and the grief and the despair as our ultimate destination of the journey. We have to be able to face that reality without denying it whatsoever, understand it, and in a martial arts way, turn the energy that comes out of that pain and that grief into a firm commitment, a resolute, gritty determination to actually do what it takes to protect nature and to protect human life. Because if we do not approach this with a firm resolve, we will lose it. So for me, optimism is not simply the result of having attained something. It is rather a strategy, the input, the approach with which we must face climate change, because it is the only way to enhance the probability of success.